1979, that great theologian, Bob Dylan, wrote a song called You Gotta Serve Somebody. And if you look at Romans chapter 6, essentially that's what Paul is telling us. Gotta serve somebody. But what I want to do this morning, as we look at how Paul unfolds this continuing argument concerning justification, is I want to identify one foundational principle, one underlying concept which Paul is resting his entire argument on, and we haven't even touched upon it yet. God's sovereignty. Now for St. Paul, God's sovereignty is on display, whether directly mentioned or not, in everything. God is the initiator. He's the one who sovereignly steps in. God is sovereign in turning people over to sin, we saw in the first 3 chapters. God is sovereign in judging sin, we saw in the first 3 chapters. God is sovereign in consigning sinners to hell in the first 3 chapters. God is sovereign in calling an idolater to be the patriarch of his church. God is sovereign in justifying that idolater before establishing the sacramental sign of that justification. God is sovereign in choosing the younger son over the elder son, in determining who will be the vessel of his covenant of grace. God is sovereign in placing the means of grace in his initial covenant community, Israel, then his final covenant community, the church, because they are a continuous manifestation of this grace, the church and Israel. God is sovereign in using his sacraments as a means of grace. God is sovereign in his redemptive activity in his Son, etc. Paul makes it very plain that sovereignty is the bedrock of what he is discussing. You may have even seen the overpowering shadow, the manifest influence of God's sovereignty as we've been going through Romans. But up to this point, we really haven't addressed this scripturally pervasive doctrine, but yet it looms large in this chapter. Now, I don't want you to get your hopes up because I see Charles smiling like a Cheshire cat over there. We're not going to be dealing with God's sovereignty or the doctrine of God's sovereignty explicitly this morning. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. But it is important that we bring it to the fore here, because I plan on tying that concept in with something that we have all encountered, but yet probably have not applied to this section in Romans. And as I mentioned earlier, Dylan's song, You Gotta Serve Somebody, if I was going to entitle the sermon anything, that's what it would be. And that'd be my second point, because as we come to chapter 6, as we've touched upon, Paul talks about, and this entire chapter talks about being dead to sin. As we read, you are either dead to sin, you yield yourself to sin, and that's what you serve, or you are alive to Christ, and you yield yourself to grace, and that's who you serve. But even in this, there's a crucial doctrine of Scripture that I keep alluding to. One that we discuss frequently in other contexts, that significantly bears on this chapter, and we hardly ever connect the two. If you remember the last time we spoke about Romans 6, we discussed baptism. And I want to expand on that a little bit today, not on the actual water itself, but on another critical connection of baptism to our Christian lives. We talked about baptism and the relationship baptism has to Christ. We talked about baptism being an identification with Christ, that in baptism we identify with him. We are united to him. We are joined to Christ. And in baptism, we are baptized into his death, his burial, and his resurrection. There is such a profound significance to baptism that we sometimes, and dare I say often, we miss one of the most crucial aspects, one of the most crucial foundational points to the meaning of baptism. You ready? You tired of me dancing around the barn now? You want to hear what I'm actually going to be talking about? All right. Baptism is a covenant sign. Baptism baptism is a covenant sign. What are we talking about when we talk about covenant? I hate that clock. In the Old Testament, in the ancient Near East, as a matter of fact, when you had the sovereign king, the powerful regent in the area, when you had this magnificent leader decide that he wanted to engage in an international relationship with another country, he would go to that country and he would implement what was called a suzerain vassal treaty. Don't get hung up on the word, it's a treaty. He's the big guy, the secondary ruler is the little guy, and he would then enter into this relationship with this vassal, this lesser king. And he would present in this document, which he wrote by his own hand, mind you, an introduction as to who he is. I am this great king. He would then list a historical prologue of all of the wonderful events, the great deeds that he had done as a king. I conquered this person, I established this great city, I developed this wealth. He would then say, as a form of this treaty that you and I have, this covenant in which we are going to engage, these are the stipulations, these are the things that you must do in order to be in this relationship with me. And then after these covenant stipulations, he would say, and if you don't, you have these covenant blessings, and you have these covenant curses. Is what would happen if there was obedience or disobedience. When you come to the Old Testament, what you see is that God sovereignly used this ancient Near Eastern form in his relationship with the Israelites. He engaged in a suzerain vassal treaty with them. Look at the Ten Commandments. Who wrote the Ten Commandments? God wrote the Ten Commandments with his own finger. He then identified himself, I am the Lord thy God, and he listed the Ten Commandments. Moses took 2 tablets down from Mount Sinai. And what we often think is that one tablet had the first 5 commandments and the second tablet had the next 5 commandments. That is not correct. Because in the establishment of the suzerain vassal treaty, the covenant document was duplicated. In other words, Moses brought down 2 complete forms of the document. And the first document would go into Israel's sacred place, into Israel's most holy location. The second document would go with the reigning king into his most sacred place and holy location. Well, when you're dealing with Israel, you're dealing with one and the same place, because the sovereign king, the great ruler, set up his home in the midst of his people, the tabernacle, and then subsequently the temple. And his holy chamber, his throne, was the Holy of Holies. And the 2 documents would be placed side by side in this Ark of the Covenant as a reminder to the nation of Israel that they are obligated to fulfill this treaty that God has established with them, because their sovereign king sits on this throne before them. This document, when it was concluded and signed by the king, the one initiating it, was complete. It was inviolable. It could not be broken. It was a completed canon of writing. And only the initiator of the covenant, only the initiator of this treaty, could change it in any way. It was a closed canon. And in order to ratify the entire process, there would have been a covenant sign. And in the Old Covenant, that sign was the sacrament of circumcision. It confirmed this prominent, transcendent covenant that God had established with Israel. Let's, for 1 minute, take a look. When you look at Deuteronomy and subsequently the rest of the Old Testament as an exposition of Deuteronomy, you see this treaty formed. What's the beginning of Deuteronomy? Well, the beginning of the whole process. Yahweh identifies himself. I am Yahweh. I am the Lord thy God. Oh, well, what have you done? I have brought you out of the land of Israel. I have destroyed the Egyptians. And he goes on. And then what does he do? He says, and you will do these things. The middle section of Deuteronomy. And then after that, from 25 on, what do you say? The blessings and the cursings. If you violate this covenant, this is what will happen. But if you keep this covenant, these are the blessings that you will receive. The entire Deuteronomic law is an explanation of the Ten Commandments. And the rest of the Old Testament is an explanation of Deuteronomy. We see the prophets. What do the prophets do? They continually remind Israel of the fact that they have broken the covenant. The prophets are God's messengers, identifying the curse they knew they would receive because they had God's document before them, God's covenant document. And according to the treaty law, 3 times a year, the document was brought out to be read to the public. Sound familiar? The Jews would bring the law out. There were 3 sacred pilgrimages that were supposed to be engaged in by everyone in this relationship in the ancient Near East. What were the Jewish responsibilities to Yahweh in the Old Testament? They had 3 pilgrimages that they had to attend every year. The treaty document form is manifest in every page of the Old Testament, and it was confirmed, it was ratified by circumcision. The physical sign that was given to the Jew that said, if you violate this covenant, you will be cut off in the manner in which this circumcision depicts. But by being obedient to this covenant, you have the right to anticipate one who will serve as the recipient of the covenant curse, and you will be blessed because of his action. So Israel has busted the covenant. The prophets have told them for years they broke the covenant. So what was required? What was required was a covenant renewal. But who could renew the covenant? Only the initiator of the covenant. So Christ comes. And Christ comes to set up a new covenant. And Christ comes to assume the curse that the old covenant demanded. And he bears the cutting off from his people in his crucifixion. He was crucified outside the covenant community. He was excommunicated to bring us into communion with God. And as we know, the covenant sign changes from the old covenant sign of circumcision to the new covenant sign, to the new sign of confirmation, to the new sign of ratification, baptism. You ever looked at our baptismal rite in the Book of Common Prayer on page 273? We present the child for inclusion in the covenant community as a precursor to entrance into the kingdom of heaven. The priest administers baptism as a remission of sin, justification. There is in the administration of water the heavenly washing, sanctification. The child is being brought into the covenant community, which brings the knowledge of God's grace as a reminder in his baptism. And in that covenant community, by virtue of being here and being trained up in the way he should go, he continues to grow in knowledge of that grace. There is a renunciation of Satan in all his works, a cutting away, a removal of Satan and all his works, a turning from death to life. The child is made a servant of God. The child is instructed to be obedient to God's holy will and commandments, and we are obligated to catechize that child. Do you understand how important? Do you understand how significant baptism is? Do we truly understand why our children leave the church? How many times have you encountered someone, how many people do you know that will tell you, oh, I'm going to go have my kid christened, baptized. I didn't know you go to church. Oh, I don't. Do you not know, as a parent, what you are saying to that child? By baptizing that child into that covenant sign, you are telling that child, I am identifying you with Christ. You are in union with Christ in the covenant community. You bear the stigma of the covenant curse if you disobey Christ. We forget that the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ has a corollary. And that is the death, the burial, and the resurrection to judgment. And whereas the child in the old covenant was circumcised and was reminded every day of his life, anytime he had to go potty, that he was a part of the covenant community. And if he violated that covenant, he would be cut off from God. In the same way, our children, when we baptize them, are being told, whenever they are told that they're being baptized, whenever they encounter that baptism later in life, that if you violate this covenant, you will be dead, you will be buried, and you will be raised to eternal judgment. The covenant sign is not a joke. It is not a mere symbol. It's not a token. Covenant sign is God putting his mark, his covenant seal on us. How many of our children would go astray if we actually believed that? If we actually believed in the importance of catechizing our children because we wanted them to come to the knowledge of what that covenant relationship truly means. The entire Old Testament, and by extension, the entire New Testament as well, the entire Bible is an exposition of this covenant relationship between Yahweh and his people, between God and man. That written covenant by the finger of God that was expounded by God's people in writing, that inviolate covenant, that treaty document that God established with his people to ensure that they receive blessing and a guarantee for the kingdom of heaven. You hold in your hands. You understand what this is? It's not a collection of books written by a bunch of nomadic wanderers 5,000 years ago. This is an explanation of God's treaty, of God's covenant with us, communicated to his emissaries directly to us in this book. We hold God's covenant treaty in our possession. How does that apply to Romans chapter 6? God is the covenant applicator. God himself. He is the covenant guarantor. As a part of that treaty, he fights for his vassal. God fights for us in our fight against sin. The covenant guarantor, God himself, protects us from our sin. The covenant guarantor, God himself, is the one to whom we serve. Covenant guarantor, God himself, is the one to whom we yield our members for righteousness and holiness. Covenant guarantor, God himself, rewards his servants from the depth of his riches. Covenant guarantor, God himself, does not repay his servants with the death that we deserve, because that covenant was guaranteed by the death of Christ and his resurrection and ascension. This is the blessing that we have in God's covenant. This is the blessing that Paul talks about in the beginning of Romans chapter 6 when he says baptism. That should have been an immediate light bulb above the head of every Jew. Oh, the covenant. God is my king. God is my protector. I am obligated out of love for what he has done for me. He gave me the sacrificial system so that I didn't have to worry about paying for my sin. It was that perfect sheep that paid for my sin. And we look at that perfect sheep who paid for our sin as the guarantee in our covenant relationship with God. It is this covenant that allows us to yield our members to righteousness and holiness. And it is this covenant relationship that allows us to depart from, to separate from sin. Because if we work for the one, the wages will be glory. If we put our effort towards the other, the wages are eternal death.